All right, well, the first one we want to take a look at, this one is actually, so he's, as you've probably picked up, he's numbered all of these. And so this is actually number 114. So that's kind of where we've worked our way to. And this one says, here's the question. When did the temple curtain rip? Right? When did it rip? Luke 23 indicates that it happened before the death of Christ, which disagrees with Matthew 27 and Mark 15. So when did the temple curtain rip?
Yeah. So the scripture says for Luke 23, while the sunlight failed, end of sentence, and the curtain of the temple is torn in two, then Jesus, calling out with a loud voice, said, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. And having said that, he breathed his last. In Matthew 27, Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit. And behold, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth shook, and the rocks were split. And then Mark says, and Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. So it seems like curtain is in Matthew and Mark being torn after the crying out, but Luke has it happening, it appears, before Jesus calls out and dies. So what is going on?
Yeah. Well, so what Lyle tells us, he says this is a failure to read the text carefully, and he calls it specious reasoning. Right? The temple veil, he says, was torn from top to bottom at the time of Christ's death. Right? And so, and of course, all three confirm that at Christ's death is when the temple was torn. Right? So he says the critic seems to have erroneously assumed that the order in which something happened is, in which something is mentioned, right? Yeah. In Scripture is the order in which it happened, and but of course there's no rational basis for this assumption. We could have. He suggests there are various and sundry ways to have counterexamples of that. So the idea here is that, just because it's mentioned first doesn't necessarily mean that it happened first. It clearly happened at the time of Christ's death, right? The temple was torn. Christ cried out. When Christ cried out, the temple was torn.
Yeah, and we've kind of mentioned this before too. This is being written by different types of authors, like Luke being Greek trained, so he'd write in more what kind of we would consider westernized sense. Matthew, being Jewish, would tend to focus on not so much chronological order of events, but kind of trying to get big pictures in there. So trying to always pinpoint down when events took place in things, depending on who the author is, might be more difficult than what we're used to, because we tend to think how things are written tend to carry out in a chronological event, which then you have this for movies. So you have Memento being one where you're not quite sure of how the story is taking place because it's being told in such literally a backwards format that you're so used to watching movies in that traditional sense, or Tarantino tends to split things up by moving back and forth across the timeline, that it is jarring when you view it. And so here it's just, we need to realize that there are different people writing for different purposes and different styles.
Right. And of course we don't believe that Tarantino is inspired, but anyway,
he might.
Lyle does point out that Luke never says or never used the word before Christ's death, right? It does not say the veil was torn before Christ's death. It's not even in Luke's passage. Right?
And the curtain of the temple was torn in two. It makes it as a mention.
Yeah. So yes, they all agree that the veil was torn at the time that Christ died. That's when it was torn. When was it torn? When Christ died.
Right. Yeah.